February 1944. 5 miles above the frozen fields of Lower Saxony, Major Heinz Bär adjusts the oxygen mask on his face, the scent of rubber and stale sweat filling his lungs. Through the armored glass of his Focke-Wulf 190, the horizon is no longer blue. It is silver. A shimmering, endless carpet of B-17 flying fortresses stretches from one edge of the vision to the other, flanked by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs whose polished aluminum skins catch the morning sun like a million mirrors. To Bär, a veteran of 1,000 dogfights, the math simply doesn't hold. He had been told the Americans were soft, their industry unproven, their numbers exaggerated by propaganda. But as the roar of 4,000 Wright Cyclone engines vibrates through his own cockpit, the terrifying truth settles in. He shoots down one, then another, but for every wing he clips, 10 more take its place. The sky is no longer a battlefield. It is an industrial conveyor belt extending from the factories of Michigan directly into the heart of the Reich. The realization is cold and absolute. The Luftwaffe is not fighting a military. It is fighting a machine that never sleeps. In the early 1930s, the hangars of Germany were cathedrals of craftsmanship. Under the rising shadow of the Third Reich, the Luftwaffe was not merely a branch of the military. It was the crown jewel of German engineering. Men like Willy Messerschmitt and Ernst Heinkel were not just designers. They were visionaries who viewed the aircraft as a singular work of art. The philosophy was simple. Superior technology and pilot skill would always overcome the crude weight of numbers. This was a doctrine born from the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany had been forced to innovate in secret, refining every rivet and aerodynamic curve until they possessed the most sophisticated flying machines on the planet. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of this force, was a marvel of tight tolerances and high-performance components. However, this dedication to excellence carried a hidden poison. German manufacturing remained rooted in the tradition of the master craftsman. Each plane required thousands of man-hours, often involving hand-fitting parts that were not perfectly interchangeable with the next aircraft on the line. When a Daimler-Benz engine failed, it often required a specialized mechanic to coax it back to life. This boutique approach to warfare functioned brilliantly during the blitzkrieg years of 1939 and 1940, when campaigns were short, decisive, and the Luftwaffe could dictate the pace of the engagement. By 1941, the German leadership, including Hermann Göring, remained under the illusion that the war would be won before the world's industrial powers could mobilize. They viewed the United States with a mix of disdain and outdated cultural stereotypes. To the Nazi high command, America was a disorganized land of jazz and skyscrapers, a nation of gangsters who were better at making refrigerators and washing machines than the complex machinery of modern aerial combat. Even as reports trickled in about American industrial capacity, the German Air Ministry dismissed them as bluff and Yankee boastfulness. They believed that while America could perhaps build thousands of cars, they could never master the intricate metallurgy and precision required for a high-altitude interceptor. This arrogance was bolstered by the sheer distance of the Atlantic. In the minds of the German generals, the American factories were a world away, irrelevant to the immediate survival of the Soviet Union or the defense of the English Channel. They focused their efforts on refining existing models, adding armor and bigger cannons to the Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, creating ever more specialized variants that further complicated their own logistics. While Germany produced exceptional pilots, the Experten, who would eventually rack up hundreds of kills, they were inadvertently building a system that relied on the irreplaceable hero rather than the replaceable system. Across the ocean, the atmosphere was entirely different. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that if the Allies were to win, the battlefield would have to be moved from the trenches to the factory floors. In 1940, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, he made a staggering public declaration. America would produce 50,000 planes a year. In Berlin, the news was met with laughter. The total production of the entire German aviation industry at the time was a fraction of that figure. To the German mind, Roosevelt's number was a mathematical impossibility, a piece of propaganda designed to frighten the German public. They failed to realize that the sleeping giant was not just waking up, it was already redesigning the very nature of human labor. The American strategy was not to build a better plane than the Germans in a one-on-one duel. It was to build a good enough plane and then build it at a scale the world had never seen. While Germany relied on specialized workshops, the United States turned to the titans of Detroit. The men who had mastered the assembly line for the Ford Model T and the Chevrolet sedan were given the blueprints for the B-24 Liberator and the P-51 Mustang. They looked at these complex machines and saw not a work of art, but a sequence of tasks. They broke the aircraft down into sub-assemblies that could be built by unskilled workers, including millions of women who had never touched a wrench before 1942. This was the birth of the arsenal of democracy. It was a shift from the qualitative to the quantitative, where the metric of success was no longer the elegance of the design, but the velocity of the output. As the German war machine began to strain under the weight of a two-front war, the American industrial engine was just beginning to shift into high gear. The disparity was not just in the number of planes, but in the fundamental philosophy of how a nation goes to war. Germany was fighting a 19th century war of knights with 20th century tools. America was preparing to wage the first truly industrial war of the 21st century mold. The transformation of the American landscape between 1942 and 1944 was nothing short of a second industrial revolution. At the heart of this miracle was the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Henry Ford on a patch of farmland. The facility was a gargantuan structure spanning nearly 3.5 million square feet. It was designed with a single, obsessive purpose: to apply the principles of the automotive assembly line to the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber composed of over 1.5 million parts and hundreds of thousands of rivets. Initially, the project was a disaster. Critics dubbed it "Will It Run?" as the complexity of the aircraft defied the rigid speed of the belt. But by 1944, the Ford magic took hold. The plant reached a terrifying level of efficiency, rolling a completed B-24 off the line every 63 minutes. To the German Air Ministry, who viewed a bomber as a project taking months of meticulous labor, this rate of production was incomprehensible. It wasn't just one factory, it was a nationwide network. While Messerschmitt struggled to source specialized alloys from occupied territories, American logistics moved mountains of bauxite from Arkansas and rubber from synthetic plants in the Midwest. In Germany, the production philosophy was hampered by the interference of leadership. Hitler and Göring frequently demanded wonder weapons: the Me-262 jet, the Comet, or the massive heavy bombers that never materialized. These shifting priorities forced factories to constantly retool, halting production to chase the next technological silver bullet. In contrast, the U.S. War Production Board prioritized freezing designs. Once the P-47 Thunderbolt or the B-17 was perfected, the design was locked in. This allowed manufacturers to produce the same airframe for years, driving costs down and speed up. The American advantage was further widened by the concept of interchangeability. In a German squadron, if a Bf-109's tail section was damaged, a replacement often had to be filed and hammered into place because it came from a different production batch. In an American P-51 Mustang squadron, a wing from a plane manufactured in Dallas would fit perfectly onto a fuselage built in Inglewood, California. This meant that while German planes sat grounded for fitting, American planes were being cannibalized and rebuilt in the field within hours. By the time 1944 arrived, the American aviation industry was employing over 2 million people. The 10,000 planes a month figure was no longer a dream. It was a statistical reality. This tidal wave of aluminum was not just a threat to the German front lines. It was a psychological weight pressing down on the German high command. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, began to see the writing on the wall. He toured the German factories, trying to implement American-style mass production, but he was fighting against a culture of artisan engineering that was decades old. The disparity in resources was equally staggering. As the United States ramped up, it began to provide its pilots with 100-octane fuel, allowing engines to run at higher compressions and speeds. Germany, starved of oil and relying on synthetic fuel from coal, could barely keep its training planes in the air. The American context was one of limitless horizons, where every citizen was a cog in a massive, well-oiled machine. The German context was one of a shrinking fortress, where the genius of the few was being drowned by the industry of the many. The stage was set for a confrontation that no amount of individual heroism could win. The Luftwaffe was about to discover that the Americans weren't just bringing a bigger air force to the fight. They were bringing a different century of warfare. To understand why the German experten were so shaken by American production, one must look through three specific lenses: the tactical, the technological, and the leadership perspectives. These angles reveal that the conflict was not just a clash of pilots, but a clash of entire civilizations' approaches to the concept of the machine. For a German ace like Adolf Galland or Erich Hartmann, aerial combat was a duel, a chivalric test of nerves and skill. The Luftwaffe relied on a small pool of highly decorated experten who flew thousands of missions until they either died or the war ended. In contrast, the United States viewed its pilots as another standardized part of the industrial process. American pilots were given 200 to 300 hours of flight training before they even saw a combat zone. German trainees, by 1944, were lucky to receive 50. Tactically, this meant the Americans could afford to lose 3 planes to down 1 German, because the American pilot was rotated home to train the next 1,000 recruits, while the German ace remained in the cockpit until he was consumed by fatigue. The German aces were stunned to find that no matter how many Americans they shot down, the skill level of the average American pilot remained consistent, while their own ranks were being filled by cannon fodder, who could barely land their planes. From a technological standpoint, the German obsession with over-engineering became their undoing. A Focke-Wulf 190 was a masterpiece of metallurgy, but its complexity made it a nightmare to mass-produce under the stress of Allied bombing. The American P-51 Mustang, while an incredible performer, was designed with a modular philosophy. It used a British-designed Merlin engine that Packard could churn out by the thousands in Detroit. The Americans treated the airplane like a consumable commodity. By producing 10,000 planes a month, they reached a critical mass where they could sustain a 5% loss rate indefinitely. To the German engineers, who spent weeks perfecting the finish on a single wing to reduce drag, the sight of roughly finished American planes, sometimes unpainted to save weight and production time, was a cultural shock. They realized the Americans didn't need their planes to be perfect. They only needed them to be numerous and good enough to overwhelm the senses. While the German industry relied heavily on specialized male labor and, increasingly, the horrific exploitation of forced laborers in underground tunnels, the American angle was defined by a voluntary social revolution. The German aces were fighting an air force built by people they had been taught to underestimate: housewives, students, and minorities. In the United States, the mobilization was total and enthusiastic. Rosie the Riveter was not just a propaganda poster. She was a statistical juggernaut. By 1944, nearly 40% of the workers in aircraft plants were women. This tapped into a human resource pool that Germany, bound by its Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church ideology, refused to utilize until it was far too late. The sheer optimism and patriotic fervor of the American workforce translated into a manufacturing speed that felt like witchcraft to the German observers. Every time a German pilot pulled the trigger, he was firing at a machine built by a society that had completely restructured its social fabric to ensure he would eventually run out of targets. At the highest levels of command, the angle was one of catastrophic cognitive dissonance. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously remarked early in the war that no enemy plane would ever fly over the Reich. When American B-17s began appearing over Berlin in broad daylight, his response was to blame his pilots rather than the math. German leadership remained fixated on quality and spirit, believing that the superior Aryan soul would prevail over materialism. Meanwhile, American leaders like General Henry Hap, Arnold, and industrialist William Knudsen treated the war like a giant plumbing problem. They focused on flow, ensuring that every part, from the smallest bolt to the largest propeller, moved seamlessly from the heartland to the front. The German leadership viewed 10,000 planes a month as a lie because their own rigid, ego-driven system could never achieve it. They were blinded by their own elitism, unable to grasp that a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics had turned the sky into a factory floor. The realization of this industrial disparity didn't just happen in the briefing rooms of Berlin. It happened in the air during the most violent week of the war, when the sky finally broke. The turning point arrived in the bitter cold of February 1944, in a week that historians would forever mark as Big Week or Operation Argument. For the German pilots, this was the moment the theoretical numbers on a page became a physical, suffocating reality. The U.S. Strategic Air Forces launched a series of coordinated, massive strikes designed to do one thing: bait the Luftwaffe into the air and annihilate it through the sheer weight of American steel. On February 20th, over 1,000 heavy bombers, protected by a swarm of nearly 900 fighters, crossed the German border. This was not the small, struggling force of 1943. This was the finished product of the 10,000 plane a month machine. The German aces, rising to meet them, found themselves in a nightmare. In the past, they could pick off bombers once the short-range escorts turned back. But now, thanks to the massive production of external drop tanks and the refined P-51 Mustang, the little friends stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and back. The air over Leipzig, Brunswick, and Regensburg turned into a charnel house. German pilots like Gunther Röhl and Adolf Galland described the sensation of being drowned. They would dive through a formation, shoot down a B-17, and pull up only to find another 1,000 bombers already droning toward the horizon. The American factories were now delivering aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could physically shoot them down. During these 6 days, the Americans flew over 3,800 sorties. They lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, losses that would have crippled any other nation. But in the United States, those 254 lost aircraft represented only a few days of work. The German losses, though numerically smaller at 355 fighters, were catastrophic in a way the Americans didn't face. Germany was losing its expertin, the veteran pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. Because the American industry was producing 10,000 planes a month, they could afford to flood the sky with average pilots who, by virtue of their numbers, eventually overwhelmed the masters. The climax was not just a battle of bullets. It was the moment the German pilots realized that their skill was being rendered irrelevant by a production line in Michigan. The sky was no longer a place of individual glory. It had become a logistical meat grinder. Every time a German pilot landed to refuel, he looked at the wreckage of his airfield and the thinning ranks of his comrades, then looked back up to see the contrails of a fresh American wave already appearing from the west. The arsenal of democracy had finally arrived in full force, and it was playing a game of numbers that Germany was mathematically guaranteed to lose. As Big Week bled into the spring of 1944, the sheer scale of American output achieved a terrifying physical presence over the Reich. The U.S. Army Air Forces were no longer just bombing factories. They were systematically erasing the Luftwaffe from the sky. By March, the production peak of 10,000 planes a month meant that the Americans could sustain 1,000 plane raids as a standard operational procedure. For the German radar operators, the screens became a solid mass of green light, a phenomenon they called the aluminum cloud. The German aces were now facing a tactical paradox. To take down the heavy B-17s, they had up-armored their fighters with heavy 30mm cannons and steel plating, making them sluggish. Simultaneously, the Americans were flooding the sky with thousands of lightweight, high-performance P-51 Mustangs. This high-low industrial mix was the death knell for the German pilot. If the German fighters stayed light to dogfight the Mustangs, they couldn't hurt the bombers. If they stayed heavy to kill the bombers, the Mustangs slaughtered them. This was only possible because America had the industrial luxury to build specialized airframes for every specific role. The psychological breaking point occurred on the ground as much as in the air. Captured German pilots often spoke of the unbelievable sight of American airfields in England and liberated France. They saw rows upon rows of brand-new aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, stretching for miles, planes that had just arrived from across the Atlantic, still smelling of fresh factory paint. To a German pilot who had been flying the same patched-up Bf-109 for months, the realization that these planes were considered disposable by the Americans was a crushing blow to their morale. By the summer of 1944, during the Normandy invasion, the disparity reached its absurd conclusion. On D-Day, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed barely 300. The German Experten, like Joseph Pips Priller, made a single, desperate strafing run over the beaches and then fled, knowing that to stay a minute longer was to be swarmed by 100 American fighters. The 10-000 plane month engine had not just won the war of attrition. It had effectively evicted the Luftwaffe from its own sky. The German aces hadn't just lost a battle. They had been buried under the sheer weight of a nation that could manufacture airplanes faster than they could manufacture bullets. The aftermath of this industrial deluge was not merely measured in burnt wreckage across the German countryside, but in a total systemic collapse that no amount of bravery could stall. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had entered a death spiral. While German factories moved underground in desperate places like the Mittelwerk tunnels, were still managing to produce a surprising number of airframes. They had reached a fatal bottleneck. They had the planes, but they no longer had the men or the fuel to fly them. The American production miracle had forced the Luftwaffe into a constant state of emergency. To counter the 10-000 plane-month output, Germany had been forced to commit its most experienced flight instructors to the front lines just to survive the big week and the defense of the Reich. This was a catastrophic strategic error. By killing off the teachers to man the cockpits, the Luftwaffe effectively decapitated its own future. By the autumn of 1944, a new German pilot was sent into the sky with barely 40 hours of total flight time, essentially a death sentence when faced with American pilots who had been trained for nearly a year in the safety of the Nevada and Texas deserts. The fuel situation was equally grim. American bombers, produced in such vast numbers that they could be lost by the hundreds without halting the offensive, focused their collective wrath on Germany's synthetic oil plants. By mid-1944, German fuel production had plummeted by 90%. The German Experten, the men who had survived 5 years of war, were now grounded, watching from the hills as endless streams of American silver passed overhead. They were witnessing the literal exhaustion of a nation. The sheer volume of American equipment also changed the nature of the ground war. Because the U.S. was producing 10,000 planes a month, the tactical air forces could afford to use P-47 Thunderbolts as flying tanks, roaming the German countryside and destroying anything that moved. Logistics, the very thing that had birthed these planes, became the weapon that strangled the Wehrmacht. Trains, trucks, and barges were systematically obliterated. The German soldier on the ground felt the weight of the American factory every time he looked at the empty sky where his own air support should have been. The arsenal of democracy had created a vacuum of power, leaving the once mighty German military blind, immobile, and starving for resources. By the final months of 1945, the statistics told a story that was almost impossible to process. The United States had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during the course of the war. To put that in perspective, at its peak, the American industry was producing more aircraft in a single month than the United States Army Air Corps had possessed in its entire inventory in 1939. The German aces, many of whom were now in Allied prisoner-of-war camps, looked at these figures with a mixture of awe and resentment. They realized that from a moment the first B-24 rolled off the Willow Run line in under an hour, the war was no longer a contest of wills, but a contest of math. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was so absolute that by April 1945, American pilots were often returning from missions over Germany without having seen a single enemy aircraft. The German air defense system, once the most sophisticated in the world, had been physically dismantled by the weight of the aluminum cloud. The remnants of the Luftwaffe's elite were reduced to flying their technologically superior Me-262 jets from sections of the Autobahn because their airfields had been cratered into oblivion. Even then, for every jet Germany put in the air, there were 50 Mustangs waiting to pounce on them during landing. The aftermath also revealed a terrifying disparity in the standard of living and logistics. When German officers were interrogated, they frequently mentioned the chocolate and cigarette shock. They saw American logistics units delivering fresh mail, hot food, and PX supplies to frontline airbases with the same efficiency they delivered spare engines. To the Germans, who had been scavenging for parts and living on ersatz coffee, this level of surplus was a final psychological defeat. The American factory hadn't just built planes, it had built a lifestyle of abundance that made the German total war look like primitive poverty. This industrial victory redefined the global order for the next half-century. The 10,000 planes a month became the benchmark for what a superpower looked like. It proved that in modern total war, the scientist and the assembly line worker were just as lethal as the sniper or the fighter pilot. The German Experten had won the individual battles, but they had lost the world to a nation that viewed war as the ultimate engineering challenge. The wreckage of the Third Reich was not just a monument to military defeat, but to the obsolescence of the artisan warrior in the face of the industrial machine. History is often written in the ink of blood, but the victory in the air over Europe was written in the grease of the assembly line. The German Experten had entered the war as the most formidable aerial warriors the world had ever seen, flying machines that were the pinnacle of aerodynamic perfection. They believed that the spirit of the individual pilot, honed by years of training and tempered in the fires of Spain and Poland, would always be the deciding factor in the clouds. They were wrong. What these pilots encountered was a new and terrifying chapter in the human story, the democratization of destruction. The American 10,000 planes a month was more than a production quota. It was a philosophical statement. It argued that a society's true strength lay not in the brilliance of a few elite knights, but in the collective capacity of its ordinary citizens, the mechanics, the housewives, and the farmers, to build a machine so vast that it simply could not be broken. The P-51s and B-17s that blackened the skies were not just weapons. They were the physical manifestation of a nation's reach. For the German ace, the war ended with a chilling realization. He was not being defeated by a better pilot, but by a faster clock. No matter how many Americans he sent spinning toward the earth, the conveyor belts in Michigan and California would replace them before his next sortie. Today, the roar of the arsenal of democracy has faded into the silence of museums, but the lesson remains etched in the annals of warfare. The conflict proved that in the modern age, the ultimate weapon is not a single brilliant invention or a legendary hero, but the invisible, relentless hum of a factory floor. The German pilots couldn't believe the numbers because they were looking for a military solution to an industrial problem. By the time they understood that the Americans had turned the sky into a commodity, the world had already changed forever. The era of the solitary warrior was over. The age of the machine had truly begun.